Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Ridge Vineyards Spring 2016 virtual tasting. My name is David Amadia. I'm the head of sales and marketing, and it'll be my pleasure to moderate today's tasting. This morning, we're coming to you live from the Montebello Estate here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We have Silicon Valley behind us, and about 20 miles off to our west, we have the Pacific Ocean, and we're sitting at approximately 2,300 foot elevation. Today we'll be tasting with you 6 wines, all of our spring releases. The 6 wines in the tasting order are going to be as follows. We'll start with the 2014 Estate Chardonnay, right here from Montebello, and then we'll do 3 Zinfandels, all from the 2014 vintage as well. We'll start with the Paso Robles, then we'll move to the East Bench, and then the 3rd Zinfandel will be the 14 Geyserville. The last 2 wines that we'll taste will come from the estate here at Montebello as well. The 13 Estate Merlot, and then the last wine will be the 13 Estate Cabernet. These are all young wines. Hopefully you've had a chance to either double decant them or pour them out in your glass and swirl them around for a bit. They'll certainly benefit from some oxygen and some time in the glass. All the wines we're tasting this morning, we double decanted about an hour ago, so that's a recommendation for all young rich wines for you. Also, you've hopefully been able to print out a tasting mat and have all the 6 wines in tasting order out in front of you. So this is an interactive event as always, so we really encourage questions and comments. It really adds to the presentation to hear from you, to know that there's live bodies out there in the audience and that we're interacting with you. So please do submit your questions and comments either through the chat function on the YouTube live stream, or even more easily to our email address at wholesale@ridgewine.com, wholesale@ridgewine.com. Joining me this morning are 2 key members of our production team. And first I'd like to introduce immediately to my left is Eric Baugher. Eric is our Vice President of Winemaking in charge of the Montebello facility here. And Eric's about to embark in a couple months here on his 22nd vintage here at Ridge Vineyards. So Eric, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, thank you.
Then immediately to Eric's left is David Gates. David is Vice President of Vineyard Operations for Ridge Vineyards, in charge of all of our estate vineyards here at Montebello and up in Sonoma County, as well as all of our growers as well. And David is about to embark on his 27th vintage here at Ridge later this year. So David, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, if I can make it.
Those numbers are big.
Yeah.
Yes. So thanks to the panel. We're missing a couple of folks today. John Olney, our VP of winemaking for Lytton, is actually in Mexico at a festival accepting an award for Ridge, so he's got some hard duty in Cancun, wasn't able to make it. And Paul, unfortunately, didn't have much of a voice this morning, and he was not able to join us as well. But we are in really capable hands with Eric and David and looking forward to the discussion. Before we jump into the wines, I just wanted to take a moment to address the drought and where we stand on that issue. We're coming to the end of our rainy season here in California. I thought it would be a good time to check in with David in terms of where we're at our vineyards, and also just to get a general sense of what the view is of the 16 vintage and what that's looking like.
Yeah, so I'm very happy, very pleased with the way this winter has gone, and cautiously optimistic about the 2016.
Cautiously?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Soon to
Spoken
tell,
like a
right?
true farmer.
Exactly. Cautiously optimistic is water-wise. We've had a great year. We had a very wet December, fairly dry January, but then it started picking up again, and we are pretty much normal across the board. We're over 30 inches. We're almost 31 inches here at Montebello, and we're at 33.5 inches at Lytton, a little bit less than that at Geyserville. Even Benito Ducey down in Paso Robles is almost to normal, which for him is a lot less than us, 14 inches, but it's still a lot better than the last few years. And unlike the last few years of drought, This year the rains have come when they're supposed to, and now
And not in big deluges too. I mean, kind of nice steady rain.
exactly,
Soak
yeah,
into the
yeah.
ground.
It's been really nice, and we've seen the effects of that on our wells. So that our well levels in Sonoma and here at Montebello have actually jumped up a little bit. They're starting to recover from the 4 years of low water, and it's looking really good.
It was amazing. It was an average year, but it felt like torrential just because we weren't used to it.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
it really
felt
did,
like
yeah.
it was raining forever, and it was really just a normal year.
Absolutely, and the roads, the Montebello Road and some of the roads in Sonoma showed that. There were lots of mudslides, some trees went down, had some fierce winds and big storms, but nothing over the top really.
Yeah.
So.
And we're able to measure our wells and to see the impact on the aquifer. We have a good sense of what the impact the rains have been.
Yeah, absolutely, and like I say, they're starting to recover nicely. I mean, the oldest well that we have on Montebello is from the early '60s, and it's almost the same water level now as when they tapped it in
That's terrific.
1962.
Yeah, that's
So yeah, but it's a really good well.
Okay.
Yeah, doesn't yield a lot, but the water is there, and
It's
so
reliable.
yes, but it's come up about 15 feet, so which is great.
Not to press you too hard, but when
Mm-hmm.
you say cautiously optimistic about the 16 vintage, you're saying average? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, maybe a little bit less than average, and a lot of that goes back to what we'll be talking about for the next few years as we release the 15 vintage. We had some pretty I hate to use the term lousy, but cold, wet weather last May, which really impacted our yields in conjunction with the drought that we were experiencing last year. Well, that same cold, wet weather, mostly the cold, in May really impacted the bud fruitfulness on the basal buds of the vines for this year. So all of our spur pruned varieties, like that, which means olive Sonoma, Zinfandel, Carignan, Petit Syrah, and the basal buds of our cane pruned varieties here at Montebello don't have a lot of cluster primordia on them. So,
All right.
so that there are 1 and 2 clusters starting to develop. They haven't. We're a couple weeks away from bloom now, but the second cluster, instead of having a wing on it, which would be a normal crop, it's got a little tendril on it. So it's like a half a cluster.
So what happens for the layman, something that happened a year ago, last May, is now impacting
Absolutely.
this harvest?
Yeah.
And
That's simple. The reason why we cane prune at Montebello is simply because of that. We the basal buds of Cabernet, if they don't have enough fruit on them because the previous spring was cool, which typically happens here at Montebello, then you end up with not enough fruit. The vine kind of goes crazy, grows a little bit more vigorously than it should, and it gets into what I kind of call the vegetative cycle of Cabernet, and Merlot will do it too, where you end up with not enough fruit to slow down the growth of the vine, so it leads to more green, more veggie wines.
so how do you attack that? I mean, are you more aggressive in terms of leaf thinning and that type of thing in those situations?
So there are 2 ways that impact it, David. One is the cane prune, so that you're exposing, so that you have available for that year's fruit, buds that were differentiating in June, July, and August. And then the other thing is, yes, we do quite a bit of leafing on the sun side here at Montebello, more so than we do up in Sonoma, or and kind of like like you would see, when I was in the mid '80s, when you'd go to Carneros and all you'd see were a wall of Chardonnay in the on the cordon vines. We don't do that, but we're close. We're pretty aggressive in removing leaves around the clusters and laterals up until just past the cluster at Montebello.
Okay. Well, I'm sure everybody's getting thirsty.
Yeah.
So let's jump into the wines. Eric, let me let you start with the first wine, which is the 2014
the
Estate.
2014 Estate Chardonnay.
There you go.
Made in the classic ridge style, barrel fermentation with the natural yeast, natural malolactics. This year's fruit, coming from the drought, caused flavor and ripeness to all hit fairly early. In fact, most of the fruit that makes this wine was harvested late August, early September, all within just a matter of a few days of each other. We were able to pretty much get most of the fruit off the vines as the flavors hit that wonderful point where we harvest. And we hadn't really even started Zinfandel harvest yet, so really we began 14 with our Chardonnay production. which was really ideal because it really ties up the press operation.
Yeah.
So we didn't have any pressure of having to work on Zinfandel tanks. So we had the luxury of picking and having the full access to the presses. In fermenting, it fermented beautifully. Again, this is all fermented and barreled down in the old 130-year-old cellar, nice cool environment, which helps promote that lengthy primary fermentation that we're after. Really leads to a lot more oils, essential oils and aromatics. And then the malolactics pretty much finished early last year. I think by the end of April, everything was complete. And it's through the malolactics that we're doing a lot of lee stirring. And there I decide how frequently to stir is by taste, because we're really trying to get some of those wonderful complex lees flavors that you get with letting the wine settle out and have some lee contact time. And then we, by taste, stir, mix the lee up, and that helps induce or impart that beautiful richness and texture. But ahead of assemblage, we have to stop the stirring. We let everything settle, and I pulled barrel samples in June last year. We blind tasted and picked and choose our favorite lots that have really good fruit focus and balance, and that's what we assembled as the estate bottling. There is a tiny little portion that we held aside as a special selection for the Montebello designation. Those lots that we selected have the greater sense of that limestone character of our subsoil,
More mineral.
and
Yeah.
more acidity, and it's a little bit more angular on the palate. It needs more time, and so we generally can bottle the estate a couple months earlier than the Montebello, because the Montebello needs that time in barrel, and then it gets another year and a half of bottle age. Whereas the estate, at release, it's ready to drink and enjoy.
Absolutely, it's beautiful.
And so this is a really wonderful, complex Chardonnay this year. It's got some of that brioche character that we're after with the surly aging. And American oak, as always. I mean, we have really moved more in that direction with our Chardonnay production.
It shows 6% French, so 94%.
Yeah, so
American.
I still have a few French barrels that I like to bring in.
Okay.
From the Allier forest of the northern part of France.
Okay.
It does add some nice kind of graphite mineral component to the wine.
It was interesting to me, Eric and David, that this was the earliest Chardonnay harvest in our history.
Yeah.
But we were able to
Yeah.
keep the alcohol maybe even slightly lower than our average.
Well, that's because, we really are getting in early on sampling and really seeing the fruit at its earliest stage to make a picking decision as soon as the grapes hit that flavor point.
So you were ready to roll.
Yeah, and we're getting really pretty good at sampling. So that we're able to really get to a point where we're pretty comfortable knowing just what ripeness we're dealing with in the vineyard, so we're not, sampling, delaying picking, and then suddenly bringing the fruit in, and it's like 25 bricks.
Sure.
No, we're pretty good. We're really getting great at getting accurate numbers from the vineyard.
That's going to have a huge impact on quality, isn't it?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we are picking earlier because we really do like the Chardonnay in the lower alcohol range. Having good acidity. I think we're making some of our greatest Chardonnays at this point.
So we have a question from Chicago, and they're tasting the wine right now, and they say that the Chardonnay in this vintage seems heavier towards a more Merlot than I remember. What brings this on?
Probably the early year.
The
Fact that it got the ripeness was, we weren't really tracking super early. We had an early bud break. Bloom was a little bit early, but then it just it was a decent crop, but not very
it was
big.
actually a little bit down in tonnage.
Yes,
about
and
6% down from
So you get a
average.
more concentrated flavor.
Smaller
Absolutely.
berries and clusters.
Okay.
And so when it got ripe, it was moving into its into getting ripe very quickly.
Yeah.
And so and like Eric said, since we picked it before most of starting the Zinfandels, that we were able to get in and pick as much as we wanted to. We didn't have to wait for a press to get press to get cleaned out from
that's
red
always
and-
the risk during harvest is juggling Zin production and Chard coming in, and if the presses are all tied up that day dealing with red fermenters, then you can't pick the Chard. The Chard then gets that extra day, and that could make the difference between 14.3 and 14.9.
Because there are only so many
Yeah.
20-hour days you guys can do on the press
Oh, I
line.
know.
The challenges of harvest, for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, and we also want to pick this fruit early in the morning when it's nice and cool.
Yeah.
Bring it in, press it, and as it's in the press, we're tasting and making cuts on the pressure points, and letting it sit in tank overnight, and then the next day it's barreled down.
Perfect. Well, good.
Yeah.
Well, let's move to some Zinfandel. David, I'll let you take the lead on the 14 Paso from Ducey.
So I'm very much liking the 2014 vintage, and I'd say, well, as you taste through them and as we have our fall release too, I think that 2014 is going to go down as a really nice vintage for Zin in terms of its opulence along with some nice structure. So Benito Ducey, I'm sure everyone's heard the story of Benny. He's been farming the vineyard since he was like, I believe, 14 years old or something, when his older brother went off to war.
World War II, right?
World War II, yes. Yeah. And so he's the sweetheart of a guy, and still does all the tractor work himself, even though he's got a bum knee. And
Well, didn't he get it fixed?
he did, yeah, but his
So
sciatica
bummed.
works up, it comes
poor
up
guy.
a little bit, but
Yeah.
but he's he does everything pretty much himself. He gets some people in, and he's had some great harvesters that have really helped out the last 5 or so years.
Okay.
They're actually table grape pickers that come over especially for him, and since he's one of the first to harvest in the Paso area.
He's not waiting for that overripeness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
He's the
So we
first
can-
to harvest, and
Yes.
it's because of our style, right?
Absolutely, yeah,
I mean,
yes.
we're in there picking early. I mean, 14.4 for
Yeah.
Paso's in. That's a record to
Yeah.
be that low.
So a couple of key, and we do have some new folks, so it's watching today, David. So feel free to
Oh,
go
good.
through some of the
So-
the tried and true here.
Yeah, so Paso Zin, it's always very up in the nose, very rich on the palate, and typically the tannins are soft enough that it just kind of disappears, and I always say it leaves you wanting another sip, right? The 14 has enough of a tannic backbone, I think, to age. We did a fascinating thing. It was 5-6 years ago, where we took and did basically a vertical tasting of Lytton Springs, Geyserville, and Paso, because we were kind of looking at Paso as a wine that you wouldn't want to age very long.
Right.
And in certain years it held up, and these could be 20, 25-year-old wines. Certain years it would hold up as well as the Lytton Springs and Geyserville. And this is one of those
tasting
wines.
this vintage, it certainly has sort of that sandy texture to it, doesn't it? Yeah, that grip to it. Yeah.
Yes.
And
But it
this,
was just beautiful fruit. I mean, when it was coming in, I mean, destemming, crush, and fermentation, and it
So
just
right away.
had that concentration
Absolutely.
just because the berries were so small. I mean, the rainfall was pretty short that
it
year.
was 6.5 inches is
Yeah.
what it's showing, which we were talking about, which is like it's like the Mojave Desert,
Yeah.
6.5 inches of rain, right? That's
Yeah,
like
that's
nothing.
less. That's about 40% of what he gets normally. I mean, if in a good year he'll be at 14 inches or more.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So 100% Zin, vines planted in 1922.
Yeah, the oldest vines are 22. There's some sections of the vineyard that he's had to replant over the last 40 years because when they were planted in 22, they were planted on their own roots.
Own-rooted.
So they end up with, as happens in most of California, getting phylloxera. So, but it's this clay soil that doesn't lend itself. The phylloxera doesn't like it as much because there's a lot of this broken down limestone in it and river rock, and so it doesn't move very quickly. The phylloxera doesn't move very quickly. So
So
over
he
time,
hasn't had to do a lot of replanting.
no, just a little bit. So they're little circles, and they just spread a little bit each year. So a few, 100 or 200 vines a year for the past 40 years.
And as far as you know, is this the oldest operating vineyard in Paso?
No, there are a couple other
Yeah.
Zin vineyards that are of the same era. In fact, Benito's late brother Dante has one that's almost as old.
Okay.
It's just across the
But
way.
they didn't rip it out?
They
or?
ripped out all of it except for about
Oh,
4 or
just a
5
little bit.
acres.
Okay.
And then there are a couple other ones that were planted during, also during Prohibition, but a little bit later. So like at 1928, 30, 32.
Okay.
But they're only about, I believe in the Historic Vineyard Society, we only have, I think, 4 Zin vineyards that
In Paso.
4 or 5 that
Okay.
that are 50 years or older. So
So most of the vineyard acreage in Paso is of younger.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Especially the the big expansion and as is the case, they're not just planting Zinfandel in Paso, even though it does really well there. There's a big
lot of
movement on
Rhone varieties.
lots of
Yeah,
Rhones and
Mourvedre,
Yep.
Mataro.
does really good, and also Cabernet because Cab is king.
Yeah,
Sell it.
Yeah, but it's a different type of cab.
Very
I mean,
much so.
it's-
Very much so.
I mean, it's a warm region, so I mean, it does make a very different style of cab.
For sure.
It works great for Zin, though. I mean,
Absolutely,
that's
we
just-
love it.
Yeah, I mean,
And-
of all our Zins, this is the one that's just got that nice bursting bramble fruit. It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
and then
Yeah.
the last little thing with Benny is, and Paso Robles, it's a huge appellation as American viticultural appellation. And a few years, about 10 years ago, they being the Paso Robles Growers Alliance, they started looking at subdividing it, and now I believe it's been
Which
a
that
few.
went through, yeah.
It did. It's
So
been a
it's
few
like
years.
12 different little sub-AVAs now.
Absolutely. So, and Benny's vineyard is in the Templeton Gap for all the you
Oh,
wine
so we
geeks
could
out
put
there
that on our
want to
label,
know.
right?
Sure.
Templeton Gap.
Why not? Why not? All right.
And what's unique about that gap? Isn't it the wind coming off the ocean?
It
It's
is,
a
so
gap
it's-
from the coast.
So that the Templeton Gap is basically follows 101 up and over to San Luis Obispo, which is where a lot of the fog comes in. Benny's vineyard is on the tail end of that, so he will get the diurnal shift without the fog typically, which is great for Zinfandel because it doesn't like fog.
It doesn't like the
Yeah.
moisture.
No, yeah.
But it
doesn't.
likes the cooling
Likes
off at
the
night,
cooling.
and that's why we've got some
perfect.
good acid. That's the unusual thing here, is that this was
Acid.
such a high acid vintage for Paso. We normally don't get this level of acidity, but it's nice. I mean, it keeps the wine fresh and quite flavorful.
Well, we should move forward
Yeah,
to our
yeah.
next 100% Zinfandel, David. I'll let you take the lead on
Sure.
our East Bench
Yeah, so-
from a completely different appellation.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is northern Sonoma County, Dry Creek Valley. And it's, we call it East Bench because it's on the east side of Dry Creek, and it's up on this benchland soil, sites and closed series soils. Red clay with some old river rock in them, or ocean rock, I guess you call it. It's rounded rock, but it's, I mean, at one point it was, had some river influence to deposit some of the soils, and then over time the ocean levels actually rose up enough to inundate that area and add some more sediment, and now and then it got lifted a little bit. So beautiful soil. It had been vineyard during Prohibition, but those vineyards were abandoned, and so for the last, until we planted it in 2000, 2001, it had been pasture land, so animals grazing on it.
Cows, horses,
Yeah,
pigs,
and,
chickens.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
No vines. So it's not exactly as virgin a soil as when they first planted it before Prohibition, but certainly better than some of the soils that have been intensively farmed for 130 years that we like right next door at Lytton West. There are 4 field selections here, all of them in the ZAP Heritage Zin collection, which we're really happy with.
So what's the dominant of the 4?
Mendocino,
Mendes-
or
okay.
Duprat.
Duprat,
Yeah.
okay.
And what are the other 3, David, just so everyone knows?
So one we call Wine Creek. It's also known in the industry as Hambrecht. And then the other one is Pichetti from here in the Santa Cruz Mountains,
Just down the
Montebello.
road.
Yeah, just down the road.
Yeah.
And then the last one is what we call Heart's Desire, and that comes from our oldest vines at Geyserville in the Witten Ranch in the Old Patch.
And so it's separate blocks, each planted to a separate field selection.
Exactly.
And-
All 100% Zin.
And did you vary the rootstock, or is it the same rootstock throughout?
It's mostly the same rootstock, mostly 110R, again for the wine nerds. Another little bit, about 25 or 30% of the block is St. George.
Okay.
And
do you see one working better than the other?
yeah, 110R.
110R.
We like it better, and for a couple reasons. It holds the leaves on the vines a little bit better. It being the 110R rootstock, it tends to handle drought a little bit better, so we don't have to water it as much. And also, it's not a St. George tends to be a kind of a scavenging rootstock, and it loves potassium, so it takes up more potassium. That
which
changes
you
the
lose your acid. In
exactly.
The wine.
It changes
Yeah.
it changes the pH of the wine, and it also doesn't make as much tartaric acid in the berries. So you end up with a wine of higher pH, different mouthfeel, and yeah, it can be problematic if it gets over 4. This never gets that much. But if you see in the ingredient labeling, there's a little bit of acid added. Those are to the St. George blocks, and they're just 2 of them. But that's and it's not very much.
So interesting also to compare 200% Zen side by side in the lineup here. Interesting to me that the alcohol level is actually higher in the East Bench and theoretically a cooler region than Paso. Is that the younger vine influence here? Is that driving that?
I would say so, yes.
Taking longer to hit that flavor point to harvest. I mean, young vines generally, you have to let them go to higher levels
to get the full ripeness.
Just to get that intensity.
And one thing that I've seen with the 14 also, and I would go back and say the same thing, kind of following what I said with the Paso, is that it has, typically it's got some good texture to it, and the tannins are there, but not like the Lytton Springs. This year, it's got a little backbone to it, and that's the 14 vintage.
It's kind of characteristic. Well, the vintage and also the Dry Creek Valley.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's got a lot of that flavor, classic Dry Creek Valley Zin.
It is a lot different, the flavor profile. The Paso is more fruit driven, more briary, and this has got a lot more sort of earthy, meaty notes to it almost. It's not quite that blackberry pie, or it's a lot more complex, isn't it?
No, it really is.
And that's the age of the vines. They're starting to get to that what the French
They're past their juvenile phase.
That's that, right.
What is that, about 15 years?
Yeah, the French, they have all these sayings, right? They have lots of sayings. And one of them is true. The first 10 or 12 or so years, you don't really know what you're going to get. They can be great one year and maybe not so great the next year. But by the time they hit 12, 14, 15 years old, then they will express themselves.
And you get a little bit more of the terroir coming through.
Absolutely, and the quality, whatever that is, will show itself pretty much year after year.
So we're getting into a good space here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
So Eric, let's move to the 14 Geyserville, which is the third Zinfandel lineup here, and very different than the first 2.
Completely different. So, the Geyserville Vineyards only about like 2.5, 3 miles from the East Bench. So it's going east and into the Alexander Valley, right on this little stretch of ancient river rock or riverbed where these old vines are grown. So the Geyserville Vineyards, a mix of some pure Zin parcels, Petit Syrah, Carignan, and then just these beautiful field blended blocks that really come together to make the heart of this wine.
Right.
So a lot of these things get picked out over 3-4 weeks, fermented in their individual tanks. So we generally end the harvest with roughly 25 different lots to taste through, to select. And again, the heart of this wine is those beautiful old vines of what we call Old Patch. And then, to that base blend, we then taste in and out some of the pure Zin blocks, the pure Carignan, Petit Syrah, to really form the structure and complexity. So this year came together beautifully. Due to the drought, it is on the slightly riper side at 14.6. I mean, we generally kind of average right around 14.4. I don't think we've ever had a vintage of Geyserville. Well, maybe in the 80s, there's some vintages that might have come in just under 14%.
In a very cool year.
But really rare. I mean, but this is a vintage of opulence. I mean, this wine has got a lot of depth. It's got the ageable tannins. We're carefully fermenting and extracting. The issue with 14, though, just because of the drought, the vines didn't really get a lot of the nutrients from the cover cropping. So the must didn't carry a lot of nutrients to the natural yeast, so the fermentations were actually pretty slow.
Slower than normal.
Not sluggish, or not stopping altogether, but just really kind of taking their time, getting started, finishing. So you can't really press off really sweet. So we just had to stay on the skins longer. We couldn't really do a whole lot of pump overs, so we're trying to get the wines as finished as possible without over extracting.
Right. So you want it to.
But in the end, it's still pretty filled out and structured and rich, and
it is a different Geyserville. Geyserville tends to be a little bit more red fruit, a little brighter, and this has gone to a little bit of a darker fruit style.
darker fruit.
Yeah.
And it's also, you know, it's one of the lower percentages of Zin.
Very low.
It
It's
is,
60%.
Yeah, and
60.
that contributes to that. You know,
So the other Rhone varieties.
24% Carignan. So you know, big. Powerful year. I mean, the Carignan that we're working with is 100-plus-year-old vines.
Right.
That's pretty special fruit. I mean, the stuff when it ferments out, it's just jet black
Okay.
and just full of plum and black cherry and gorgeous flavors.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So why such? I mean, on average, what would you say an average year for Zinfandel in the blend would be for Geyserville?
It's generally just over 70.
Yeah. So
You know, and then 18% Carignan, 8% Petit Syrahs average.
was it just that was the drought harder on Zinfandel than on other varieties? Is that what
Yeah,
happened?
I mean, we saw a drop off on yields on some of the
Okay.
pure Zen blocks, whereas the later ripening varieties managed to set better crops.
Okay.
Yeah,
So we
14
just
for
had
Carignan
volume-wise, we had better amounts of Carignan and Petit to add.
Okay. David, it's probably a good time to talk a little bit about this vintage coming up will be our 50th anniversary.
What's in the cellar right now? The 50, the 15 vintage.
And also our purchase of the Lytton Ranch and what that means to Ridge.
Yeah, it's a neat kind of trifecta. With Geyserville, sorry, being the first major production of Zinfandel, besides from the hill here, that actually before Paul was started at Ridge, it started in '66, and we've been working with the Trentadue family ever since then, and that's really nice. And also they purchased the vineyard up there, I think in early '66, and immediately sold some fruit that year to Dave Benyon, the winemaker. And the year before, there were some vines that had been planted there, so they're the middle-aged Zinfandel vines are now going to be registered in the Historic Vineyard Society.
It's over 50 years old now.
Exactly.
Okay.
So 50th vintage, 50 years old for some of the vines. And then after taking out a 32-year lease in 1990 on the Lytton Ranch property, which is the heart of this wine, we were able to finish purchasing it, I think the 10th of January.
January this year,
At 1 p.m. No, I who's that counting? Anyway, that's really special because now that site is a true estate vineyard and it can't be taken away.
I mean, we will make Geyserville forever now.
It'll ensure it'll be a Ridge wine forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
It is the heart of this wine. I mean, we have a couple other vineyards that are just south of the Lytton Ranch that can make some nice additions to this blend, but really the heart of what has made the most beautiful Geyservilles of our past is really there at Lytton Ranch.
What makes it unique is the age of the vines, the field blend, and then the soil,
the
right?
soil.
Yeah.
The soil absolutely is the most special part of that vineyard.
So that's great.
Yeah.
So great news. A lot to talk about with Geyserville with this release, and then the 50th anniversary vintage coming next year will be something else.
To have a party out in the vineyard, right?
Something else to talk about.
Yeah.
So that's terrific. So finishing off on the Zinfandels and now moving back to Montebello and some Bordeaux varieties. And David, why don't you kick us off on the 13 Estate Merlot?
Sure. A few years ago, we decided to we bowed to David Amadia's
Commercial pressure.
Absolutely,
Pressure.
and took it on ourselves to make the estate Cabernet a Cabernet instead of an estate wine that would be a blend of a non-varietal specific
kind
blend.
50-50 Cab Merlot is
Exactly.
kind of what we were bottling.
And so one of the results of that is our estate Merlot, because we up until last year we have too much Merlot to just go into the estate Cab. So and 13, I love this wine. I think it's going to it's going to age really well if you like that. But it's got so much nice fruit on it now that it's just gorgeous. And the heart of this wine are 2 blocks. One of them planted before I got to Ridge in 1984. Yeah, sorry.
1884. Just before you got here.
Yeah, just before. That actually was planted as Cabernet and then was budded over to Merlot.
Oh my God.
Yeah, a year or so in, and that was with the help of the Ridge partners, with Almano Homem, who just passed away this year, and the Schwabacher family, the owners of the Geyserville Ranch. And then in 1997, so a year after we took out a lease on the Geyserville Ranch, we were able to plant another little 4-acre block of Merlot, which is and so those 2 blocks and several parcels of wine made from them are what is the heart of this wine.
Yeah.
100% Merlot, really juicy fruit on it, I think, and still some good, not the gum, but but the red cherry, black cherry.
Really good vintage here on the mountain. I mean, the yields were not that large that year. The drought was pretty severe. I mean, the rainfall was what, 11 inches?
Yeah, again, and the only thing that really saved it is about half of those inches of 11 inches of rain came during the spring, so that was available to the vines.
Yeah.
We were very aggressive with weed control, so that as much of that water that made it into the ground, it didn't get consumed by the weeds. It got consumed, the cover crop, it got consumed by the vines.
Yeah.
And the vines just made it to harvest. There was an fairly early harvest.
Yeah, I mean, we were...
And the vines needed that to get the fruit off because they were hurting.
Yeah, 9th of September. I mean, that is...
It's
I mean, that's generally when the Zin is coming off.
Yeah.
That's right.
But here we were, picking Merlot. And then probably one of the last blocks came off 2nd of October. Which would be more of a normal time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, what's your thoughts on Merlot right now, Eric? I mean, we made it as a single varietal in the '90s and took a break, and now we've made it again for several vintages.
We're back into the Merlot business.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's a beautiful variety.
It
I mean,
is.
it's an important grape to Bordeaux, to the right bank. It's always been a very important grape to us here at Montebello for blending with the Cabernet, making Montebello.
Sure.
So now it's fun to have it as 100% a standalone.
Yeah.
Coming from this great site. I mean,
I would also throw in that the Santa Cruz Mountains, it again with the Chardonnay and with the Merlot, and of course with their Cabernet and our blends in Montebello, it shows that it's a special place to grow grapes, where it can take a variety that people will say, I want a glass of Merlot because there's no tannin to it, and it's a slightly sweeter. Anyway, this is not
your simple flabby Merlot. This is structured, really complex.
Not a typical California Merlot.
Yeah, it's got the acidity, it's got the minerality.
I mean,
really
it's so different than other Merlots grown in other parts of California.
Absolutely.
Really isn't. I have a hard time finding a comparison to this wine produced in California. There's not too many.
I mean, you have to go to Bordeaux.
And even that's going to be very different too.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily right bank Bordeaux. This is a lot more of the kind of gravel mineral character of a left bank.
That's right, more of
And
the
it's hard to
minerality.
yeah,
for sure. It's a very unique wine. I really love it. In the Santa Cruz Mountains, just to talk about that for a second, as an appellation, is sitting on the board for that now and trying to figure out what the messaging is. I mean, part of the challenge is that although Pinot is becoming, the predominant grape here, it's an area that does so much. It produces so many different varieties.
It's such a
here.
wide geographical area that it has the diversity allow you to grow many different varieties and do so really well.
And that has to be the message for the appellation. It can't be we're a Pinot producer.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could make the San Andreas the fault line, the
dividing line.
the dividing line, Cab to the east, Pinot to the west.
So when the big earthquake comes, it'll be a lot easier to make that argument. Right?
Yeah.
Or when
Okay.
the ice caps melt, and the Stevens Creek fills up with water.
They'll divide the appellation nicely.
Yikes.
Okay.
We digress.
Yeah.
All right. So Eric, why don't we?
So here we're tasting the Cabernet next
now,
to it. Yeah.
which is absolutely awesome.
So you can see here, this is a classic left bank blend. I mean, we have some Merlot in this. It's dominant Cab, 75%. So there we hold the line by blending and by taste. We did add 20% Merlot and 3% Petit Verdot and Franc. So these were parcels that were left over after the assemblage of Montebello. And actually for this wine, we kind of began to make the selection in the fermenter. Kind of knowing the history of a block as the fruit's harvested, brought in, we de-stem, whole berries, sort, receive into the fermenter. The next day we do our pump overs. And I really do taste the juice at that moment to really get a sense of, does it have Montebello-like character? Or is it going to end up being much more softer, slightly less complex fruit than Montebello? And if it's that, I'm going to be much more gentle on the extraction.
Absolutely.
It's trying to make a balanced wine.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal of these two wines, is to make a wine you can drink young. You don't necessarily need to lay these down in cellar for 15 years before you open them.
It's great. I mean, and that's really evolved over time. If you go back 15 or 20 years, we were making the estate just like the Montebello,
we were trying to
right?
make every single parcel here Montebello.
Right.
And some parcels, because of where they are on this mountain and the soil, they just will never do it. You know, they're in these high vigor sites where they've got the underground springs. You know, the berries are bigger, and you know, you got a little bit more kind of racy flavors in the fruit that are not really classic Montebello. And so those areas will never make Montebello.
Yeah.
So at least now we've kind of recognized that, and we can kind of make our selection in the fermenter and taste and be very careful on the extraction.
I mean, still to me, probably the best value of any wine that we produce.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you
every
compare
time
it to
we've
Montebello,
done those comparative blind tastings,
with
other
that,
wines double or 3 times the price, and yet there's the estate cab.
right there.
Oh, it's a grand vin. I mean, it's amazing.
It's terrific. And so the question that we've come through is that why can't we have more of this?
Well, patience. I mean,
So
I
maybe
mean, sort of. I mean, the great thing about 14, I mean, it was a little bit short tonnage for Chards, but here at Montebello, because we have more acreage now producing slowly as we're replanting and developing more acreage, I mean, 2014, we actually got a pretty good slug of fruit.
Okay.
The yields were just a little bit above average.
Yeah, I mean, I would say go to our tech sheet
Yeah.
and look at the very bottom right, and it says 1.1 tons per acre. That's kind of
that was 13 vintage.
Yeah,
I mean, the
that's-
yields weren't
so.
that large.
We talked a little bit earlier about the 13 vintage and Paso, or up here too, where about half of the rain that we got came in the spring, and it was immediately available to the vines, and that's how the vines made
Saved
it.
them.
Well, so the Cabernet was blooming during those rains. The Merlot and Chardonnay had just finished bloom along with the Zinfandel. That's that's the quandary that you have. So we needed the rain. We didn't necessarily need it then.
Right at that moment, though, that was bad.
So it shattered quite a bit in the cab.
Oh, this is just the quandary of fine wine, though. It's not a factory, right?
No, it's not.
No,
Yeah,
we
it's
can't
not
go
a
out
widget.
and buy fruit or bulk and blend in, but no, this is entirely made from our own fruit.
So maybe a good time for, on the positive side, David, an update on our new plantings here, and what are the new plantings are going into the wines now, and what's the future look like?
Sure. So the Rooston Ranch, which is situated between the Klein Vineyard and the Torrey Vineyard,
Sort of the middle,
which is
right?
where we are. Yes. That we finished planting that last year. In fact, we'll do a little bit of budding here in another month or so on the last few vines. We will get some fruit off of the half of that planting that we already have done. It will make up about, I'm trying to remember, I just did this up. We'll get probably out of that 27 acres, we'll probably get between 30 and 35 tons of Cabernet. Not all of that 30 acres or 27 acres is Cabernet, but of the cab, we will get about 30 or 35 tons. Eventually, that should give us about 50 to 65 tons of cab.
Cab Franc,
And
Petit
then
Verdot.
plus 8 to 10 tons of Cab Franc and a little bit of Petit Verdot, So it's coming. It's just that first the vines have to produce, grow up enough to produce. And you have to make the wine, then you have to age the wine, then you can sell it. So little by little, we will get there.
And we have more acreage now up at Peroni. I mean, we planted what is now Lone Oak.
Yes.
So that's going to give us some more fruit this year.
We're going to start
And
to
we
get
have
some more
some
fruit
fallow
there.
blocks that are going to be ready for planting next year.
And the open space that we were able to conclude the open space transaction, we will start clearing the land next year and planting it, and so that will eventually give us be approximately the same size as Rooston.
Okay,
A little bit bigger acreage, but probably yields will be a little bit lower just because it's sitting at 25, 20
Higher
100 feet.
elevation.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, but that's a long-term investment, long-term strategy.
So what, 2030 is the kind of the magical year when it's all planted out and maybe at
Yeah,
full
should-
production.
It'll be a little before
Yeah.
then, but not much,
2025,
Yes,
yeah.
there you go. Yeah.
At least that's what I've been planning.
Yes,
I mean, to
yeah.
have enough fermentation space and
Yes,
barrels
exactly.
and all.
So also maybe a good opportunity just to talk about organic for a moment. Our East Bench continues to be labeled as certified organic on our back labels in our ingredient list. What else is new on that front, David, here at Montebello and up in Sonoma County?
So we're still transitioning a few acres up in Sonoma that will allow us to, with the potential to do, besides Geyserville and Lytton, maybe the Petit Syrah estate as organic, but that's going to be a few years out before that actually goes through. Last year, if the yields had been more normal, we could have potentially done Geyserville and Lytton Springs as organic, but because we were scrambling and scrambling for yield or tons, and the quality was so high, we decided to sacrifice that.
Yeah.
So if we have a decent year
Yeah,
this
we'll see.
year,
I mean,
it's a good
2016
chance.
would be
Yes.
really ideal if we can do it.
For both Lytton and Geyserville.
And the same thing
And
here
even
at
Montebello.
And
same
Montebello
thing here
as
at
well in
Montebello.
16?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so that's great news. I mean, obviously everything in the wine business takes years.
Oh, it
You know,
does.
we're not talking days or months, but we're talking years. But I mean, it's moving, and I think you need a lot of credit, David. And we've come a long way in the last 8 or 9 years from 0 to well over near 90%, 90%.
85, probably
Yeah.
85%.
Of all our vineyards certified organic. So that's a huge jump in less than a decade.
Yeah,
to
no, that's.
move.
I want
Yeah.
to stress that those are organically grown grapes, not organic wine.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
No, we're not
Okay, good.
doing
We're talking
the
about the
organic.
vineyard.
I mean,
Talking
yeah.
about the vineyard. Yeah.
I mean, we're as organic as we can be in the winery, but we still will make our SO2 additions.
Sure.
And keep those additions low, but we cannot make wine with no sulfur. I mean, that would just lead to some real instability and flavors that will be going off in all sorts of different
Variability.
directions. A lot of bottle variability, let's say. Yeah.
Kind of like the old days.
Yeah.
If you
A
want
surprise in a bottle.
If you want
Yeah.
real traditional,
Yeah.
right? So, well, David and Eric, thank you very much
Yeah,
today. I
thank
appreciate
you.
all your great comments and
Yeah.
insight into the wines. It was really terrific. And I want to thank the audience for your attention and tasting through the wines with us this morning. We really appreciate it. Good luck with these wines out in the market. I'm sure you're going to be very successful. And look forward to seeing you all in person in the near future. Thanks again for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.